How's it going, everybody? So here we are. This is my second time recording this video. If any of y'all saw the about 2 to 3 minutes this was up without any audio. So welcome to the Dawn of Heroes tier list. This is kind of the Ghoul 02 guide to the metagame at large. We're going to go ahead and dive in real quick. We got to do my normal thing. Disclaimer, tiering is very complicated. It's very much an individual process. I'm not omniscient. These are all very opinions. The game is very unsolved. I would not be surprised if there were multiple decks that I know nothing about that are secretly the best deck in the format. I think that, for example, I think in Opus 18, none of us really tried CloudPod, and CloudPod I think arguably was the best deck in Opus 18 that nobody played. I'm going to try to use results, but I do have personal biases that I do think will skew things if I have a kind of a tie. And the cards are not deck lists, just kind of me trying to pull cards to showcase why a deck might be good. With that out of the way, let's go over my descriptors. So Tier 1, these are the Uber threats. These are the decks that you will see in Top Cut in winning events. These are the decks that if you are not building to beat these decks, you will lose to these decks. Tier 2, these are less common. Might need a favorable bracket or like an unknown innovation. They are capable of winning events still. Tier 2 is still good, just that there's potentially some small things holding them back. Tier 3, this is the very bottom of what I'd expect to get in Top Cut. I think it's possible to get there with luck, but I don't think these are decks that have a real chance at winning. Rogue, these are decks with severe flaws, but they will win Swiss rounds randomly, even against better decks than them. And then everything else, there's a gazillion decks in the game. I can't possibly tier all of them. And yeah. Here was the tier list last set. Just to kind of give myself a grade real quick. I had Fire Lightning 13 is the best deck in the game. Soiree with Wall is second. Yuffie Cast, this one was a little bit of a miss. I would say this was really more of a tier 2. Ice Wind ended up being this slot. Mono Water, Ice Earth. The only real deck that I think I was missing was like Rainbow, Earth, Water, Rydia. I had Earth, Water here, which was like most Rainbow lists used Earth, Water as their core elements. But when I made this, this was not particularly solved. I just saw it as a deck with potential. As far as tier 2, I had Fire, Ice, 13. This just wasn't played. I don't think it was worse than tier 2. It just, nobody played this when they could play Fire, Lightning. Every other cast deck. Ice Lightning in Tier 2 ended up being decently accurate. It got in Top Cut a lot, never won anything. Same for Earth Lightning. I did miss Chaos Arc, and Earth Lightning was the best variant of Chaos Arc. Avalanche was a miss. Avalanche probably should have been about Tier 3, but Cloud Pod probably should have been here. Probably the biggest miss is here in Tier 3. I had Fire Ice 6. This was arguably the top of Tier 2 last set, I would say. Ninjas, Earthwind midrange, Dragoons. Yeah, all these decks had some kind of a showing. Magissa probably could have snuck into Tier 2. But other than that, this seems about right. And then Rogue, these are decks that I have seen people lose to. Rydia Turbo maybe could have been Tier 3, but most Rydia decks were not going for the Turbo variant, where you're like Ursula, Yang with Sophie and all that. They were really trying to use Rydia as a supplement to cast Sildra early and often to get Warrior of Light into play consistently. Of note, this Golbez was intended to be Opus 1 Golbez. The Warp Archfiend stuff actually probably was about Tier 3, I think. So here is my tier list for Dawn of Heroes. A lot more decks, actually, which is cool. I think there's a lot of really good decks that came out this format. Here we go. So Tier 1, I think the best deck in the format is Rydia. No surprise whatsoever here. I think Cecil is effectively the best possible card they could have printed for this deck to be good again. It is so powerful and so oppressive and so comprehensive, and it just does everything. There's just nothing like what Rydia does. I think Fire Lightning 13.5, as in like you can integrate a Scions package, is still incredibly powerful, provided it dodges exactly Xenos. Xenos is a problem card that I do not know how this deck is going to handle if it comes into prominence. Ask Steve Sauce what he thinks, if there is a way to play where Xenos does not completely demolish this deck. But that is my big fear for Fire Lightning 13. That said, there was no Xenos in Top Cut in Portland. So if Xenos doesn't show up in Top Cut lists, this deck may actually be a problem. 6-1 Portland, I still think it's clearly tier 1, clearly very good. I think it was the most represented deck in Top Cut. I just believe in Rydia more, and I think Fire Lightning 13 has more history to it as a slightly better deck. I think Fire Lightning 13 also tends to be has much better skewing matchups. 6 has a lot more even matchups. I think Fire Lightning 13 will have decks that it will just demolish. Scions, this surprised me. I didn't think Scions were going to actually be tier 1 when I read the new support, but turns out it makes for a very nice, comprehensive package, and I didn't expect that actually. Mono Water with or without Mira, I think is also tier 1. This also can include Leo, but I think I would personally like. To me, Leo takes a lot of what Mono Water does well and drops it down to about tier 2. To me, Mono Water Leo is like Ice Wind, but slower with a more explosive late game. But like Ice Wind is so explosive, do you need is it not just kind of more win more at that point? I think the Mono Water Mira and Mono Water are just kind of the better versions of Leo, but it did get top 4. I think it was first after Swiss, so it is a deck to keep an eye on. Chaos Arc is just really not a deck by itself. It's just kind of a modifier you can apply to Scions. I've seen it applied to Mono Water. I've seen it in Ice Lightning. I've seen it in Earth Lightning. Chaos Arc is arguably the best thing you can be doing. If you can continuously cast Arc every single turn, you're going to win a lot of your games. The only thing I will say is this does not pair with Rydia. Rydia tends to go to a low hand size. Chaos and Arc requires you to keep them in hand because you can't do anything with them. So I don't think it goes in Rydia. It definitely goes in like Earth, Water. Une is fine. But Rydia specifically really does not mind going to a low hand size. And Chaos Arc will slow you down and break you. Do not try to combine these two archetypes. In my opinion, as what I would be a self-proclaimed Rydia expert. Ice Lightning, I think, got a lot of buffs this set, especially with Turks. In particular, I think just running Rudes and Renos, and especially Rufus. Like, Rufus by itself would be played if it was printed last set. So getting the actual discount potentially is more than worth it. And lastly, I think Relm Monsters is actually maybe one of the best decks in the format, having played it. This one is tier 1, I think, by strength, not by playability. There's really only a couple pilots that I would trust to play this deck at the level that it needs to be played properly. But Realm is maybe one of the strongest cards in the game for, hilariously, just this little Dissidia hero printed in, like, gosh, what was she? Opus, 11, Opus 10. For tier 2, Ice Earth, we have Soiree with Wall. We have the rest of our cast decks that aren't exactly Ice Wind, Earth Lightning, Cloud Pod, Magissa Twins. I'll dive into all these later. Tier 3, Avalanche Ninjas, Earth Wind Mid-Range, Dragoons, Warriors of Light, Black Mages, Sky Pirates, Guardians, FF12 good stuff, Archfiends, and Mono Fire good stuff. And in Rogue we have Monks, Bartz, Boko, Dancers, Knights, and Opus 1 Golbez. So here we go. Let's go through our tier 1. So Rydia Turbo. The big new tool is Cecil. So a lot of previous Rydia builds would end up using Ursula into Yang as a 4CP 4 forward that ended up putting 2 counters on Rydia. Cecil is a 2CP forward that puts 2 counters on Rydia and has positive effects beyond, like, being able to throw her dad at the opponent's board or reviving Sophie. On top of that, Rydia runs a lot of high-cost summons, most of which will have EX Burst. Cecil, dealing yourself a point of damage, does end up being a positive a lot. You can hit a lot of EX Bursts and kind of abuse the synergy between Rydia and Cecil. This deck is absurd. I've seen it played Earth Water. I've seen it played Tricolor for Twins. I've seen it played Rainbow to play with Warrior of Light. Warrior of Light being cheated in off of 5CP Cecil means that you can have a 6-counter Rydia with a Cecil protection and a Warrior of Light, and the game is just kind of over at that point if that case. And then Une is just maybe the best legend printed in the last couple of sets. There's a debate here between this and Warrior of Light, probably. but especially if you're on the Rydia variant, the Rainbow variant, you can even run stuff like Zidane. I don't agree with running Zidane. I'm not a big fan of the card, but you can do that if you want to. Fire Lightning 13. I don't think this needs much of an explanation if you've seen Steve Sauce play or just any good 13 players. The biggest thing that's new is the 0.5. I think it's very possible to run stuff like the new Alize to revive the Y'shtola, stuff like the Estinian is really, really nice in this deck, being able to warp him off of a top deck and then double strike for either game or removing big blockers. Stuff like Grahatia to pull out the Estinian or the Y'shtola to push for a late game lethal push. It is a little bit tight on space at that point, and you're running into a lot of name clash, weirdly. I really like the 4CP Opus 17 Alize in 13, just because Vanille Special is so freaking broken. But at minimum, every single 13 player, just go ahead, take 2 slots out of your deck, slot into Estinians. You will not miss any of the other cards you took out for him. Fire Ice FF6. So this is a deck that won the Portland Materia Cup. Do I think that makes it the best deck in the format? It's really close between this, Rydia, and 13, in my opinion. Most of the decks that did well in Portland were the title variant, where you run 50 Category 6 characters. I think those decks are clearly very good, very potent, very powerful. Opus 15 Lock is a really, really powerful card. My big fear with that is how much it reminds me of Cloud Pod. And if the Opus 15 lock gets answered cheaply and quickly, you kind of can just lose the game on the spot. However, I think the Setzer is extremely good. The new lock is really good. And this new lock actually does open up a lot of possibilities for the deck. You can now, assuming you're willing to give up the Opus 15 lock, which may or may not be correct. Again, I am not necessarily an FF6 expert. But you can run things like Amaterasu. You can run Unicorn, which is a 2CP cantrip that bounces an opponent's forward and activates your own forward, which is absurd. Like, wow. And you need water cards anyway. You can run Andoria with the new lock and just get pot of greed on a party attack while doing all the damage the party attack would have done normally. You can run Loporit, which I think is just one of the best backups in the game. You can run the Class Moogle to kind of help color fix. There's so many options in this deck once you kind of distance yourself from the title format. And I'm really curious to see if that ends up taking off, or if we're going to stick with our current title variant, and those are going to continue to do well. Either or could be true. Honestly, I wouldn't even be surprised. I know that some people are so averse to that Opus 15 lock missing, but Opus 15 lock does register Unicorn as a Category 6 cast. It's a whiff, but it does draw you a card off of it. So it would be a 2CP cantrip that also draws a second card, which just sounds absurd. Maybe that's just worth it. Like, I don't know. All I know is this deck has a lot of potential, and it's shown a lot of power so far. Also, that could be Fire, Ice, Water as well. The water cards are really, really good. Scions. So the biggest thing here is Alize, Alfino, Y'shtola, and you can run a couple of extra Y'shtolas, but also 2 Louisoix as kind of your base engine. It's about 11 cards, and Alize Alfino is just kind of... It's a 4CP Shinryu that also puts 2 decently large bodies on the field, while also supporting your engine, making Y'shtola have a giant shrink. You can give them First Strike with Y'shtola. Y'shtola has a one-sided board wipe as a special. There are good other Y'shtolas to run. I have seen this deck played Pure Lightning. I've seen it played Lightning Fire. I've seen Earth Lightning. I really like Wind Lightning. I've seen Water Lightning. I'm sure you could make this work in Ice Lightning. The engine is compact enough where you could do that if you really wanted to. Would you? Probably not, but you could. So I think this deck is really, really good. I think it's a deck that good pilots are going to get a lot more mileage out of. It reminds me a lot of like Mono Water in the way that you can just consistently toolbox into the best cards in your deck. If the matchup calls for it, you can go get a one-of copy of Fel Thanos to just kind of win the game on the spot. You can get the Shinryu out of your deck with the Alphino, you can just do so many really, really impactful things. I think it's a really, really powerful deck. Mono Water. So I have two different variants of this. So Mono Water was expected to be hit a lot by the Sildra ban, but I think that there's a couple cards that really make me kind of just think that the deck is going to do just fine. First one is Loporrit. I think this is maybe the best backup that's been printed since, what, Sarah? I have been jamming 3 of this in just about every water deck, and I don't regret it. This thing is absurdly busted. It lets you color fix. It puts Garnets back in your deck. It's breakable for late game. It's a 2 CP backup by default that also becomes a 1 CP backup if you're willing to tap a backup for it. It does everything. It's multi-playable, so you don't feel bad trying multiples of it. It's a standard unit for Graha if you're on that. And lastly, Mira is really, really good, and Water has the largest density of good monsters. There's even a lot of incidental Mira support. There's Tonbetty, which can just search Mira out of the deck, or if you want to, you can. Sorry, I'm fiddling with coins while I'm talking, so just kind of do things. But you have an EX burst that searches Mira. There's also another one that gives Mira 1,000 power if you're worried about Brynhilders in your local metal game. And you can do stuff where you don't run summons to run Cleone. I think is completely valid. Cleone sack to a Mira draws you a card. Blue Worm is maybe the best monster in the game. Sack it to a Mira. Octomammoth, fantastic card. Sack it, play it, bounce 2 things, sack it to a Mira. Play another Octomammoth, bounce another 2 things. You just kind of end up in the situation where Mira kind of copies the entry and exit effects of any monsters you want to. And Water has the best density of good monsters anyway. You also have access to stuff like Relm. You have access to... Blue Goo is crazy. Yeah, just so many good monsters that you don't mind kind of copying their entry effects from Mira. And then Mira herself is a very powerful card. And she doesn't even interfere that much with Lena because she sacrifices a monster to play herself, and that monster is going to probably be Water unless you're sacrificing a late game Evray. Spoilers, Realm pulling Evray Atomos is busted. All of the Wind cast decks, I'm going to kind of talk about these all at once because they all do similar things. Icewind is probably still the best of these, but it's pretty close. If you're a more confident mono Wind pilot, it's still good. Wind Lightning does do very well into 6 because you can crack a Locke and a Celeste, or you can crack an Edgar and a Sabin, or any combination of the above for 2 CP. That's really not a card advantage thing they can come back from. But these, the only thing I will say about these is you are going to be kind of playing for your life the entire time. It kind of feels like a lot of times the Golden Wind decks is just get to the point where you are outscaling your opponent right before you're about to die, and then you just win the game on the spot with the amount of just busted win cards that are in the game. I would be scared to play this in a tourney, just given that, but the power of the cards is undeniable. They are maybe the most powerful. Wind has maybe the highest density of powerful cards in the game. It's just a matter of, can you get to those before the opponent runs you down, because Wind does not have a lot of good defensive options. Chaos Arc, again, I kind of talked about this. This is just a modifier you can apply to other decks. Maybe the most powerful thing you can be doing is free casting a summon multiple times that breaks a forward and makes your opponent discard 2 cards. I like Man in Black over Une as the partner for this, just because Une does not do anything on entry. So, sure, you get a big advantage, but you're also bouncing stuff, so your opponent has a chance to do a lot of crazy things on the crackback. Man in Black just lets you go Chaos Arc, Man in Black Arc, which is, I think, a little bit better. That said, Une, what people call Dark Une, is still very good. Water obviously pairs very well with Chaos, but I will never sleep on this. This deck is very good. Ice Lightning. Ice Lightning still has been doing kind of what it's been doing. The biggest change here is the addition of Rufus. Rufus is kind of Physalis at home, but also can be 2 CP as opposed to the full 5. So If your opponent has cards in hand, you can attack with Rufus to make them discard, much like Physalis could. But if they do have an empty hand, much like Physalis did, Rufus can get you back a Turk, which is like drawing a card. So it's kind of like Physalis with a discount, but Physalis is such a Physalis is one of the only cards in Ice that does stuff when your opponent has a low hand size. Rufus does both. Rufus forces your opponent to low hand size and reduces their options, while also finding a way to maintain value if your opponent does the smart thing against discard and empty their hand. And for that, I think Rufus is extremely important for most Ice Lightning builds now. And Sephiroth and Zeromus are just still busted. Relm Monsters, this is really just abusing how good Relm is at pulling really good things out of the deck off color. Atomos maybe shouldn't have been printed, and Goblin, like if you go Relm, Atomos, Goblin, tap a backup, play another Goblin, Atomos refunds more CP than the Goblin cost, and the Goblin replaces itself in hand, so you can kind of just ramp from there. I think this deck has a lot of potential. The biggest downside for it right now being that you're burning a lot of really good cards. You're burning a lot of your water cards. You're burning your wind card, or like two of the best cards in wind in Atomos and maybe Evray, and you're burning Amaterasu. You're burning basically a lot of the reasons to be playing fire. That said, this deck does a lot of really cool things. It's the best Mira deck I've ever seen as far as the old Earth Mira, due to some self-damage with Bosch. It's uses the promo lightning really well. It uses normal lightning really well. Just a really, really cool deck. Maybe one of my favorites I've ever seen. This is one that really only has a couple of people that play it, but I think the power level is enough for me to be confident putting this in tier 1. I think this deck does things that no other deck actually does. Tier 2. Hopefully you guys are caught up with me a little bit. Take a little bit of a breather. Ice Earth. This is the stun deck of the formats. Maybe one of my least favorite decks to play against personally. Please, if you're listening, Kageyama, ban Scaletoad. I am so tired of this untargetable frog, meaning I don't have options for my opponent's turn. This deck does what it does. Effectively, it forces you to go all in because otherwise it's going to discard your entire hand, and when it discards, it gains value off of that. So the smart thing is to dump your hand, but you can't dump your hand because the Earth side of it says that if you go too aggressive or too all in, they're going to board wipe you and then just lock you out of the game. I don't enjoy playing against this deck. I think it's really obnoxious. It has its bad matchups, but it does. The lockout state this deck gets to is maybe the most comprehensive way to win a game that exists in Final Fantasy TCG. Soiree with Warrior of Light. I had this in tier 1 last set. I think that by the end, it kind of showed its true colors as maybe the top of tier 2. Just the ceiling of this deck is just not very high. Cecil is still very good. Adele is still extremely good. Merrill is really good. You have a naturally high EX burst count, but when you compare what Soiree is doing versus what Six is doing and what Rydia is doing and what Mono Water is doing, you're just not on the same axis as far as doing unfair things. And I think that just for that alone, I think it's a little bit lower than some of the other options. If you're comfortable on Soiree, Soiree is still a very viable, very good deck. Earth Lightning, mostly I think this is a shell for Chaos Arc, but even as just a normal control deck, Vanille, Man in Black, X-Death, Melusine, Lilith, Robo Akbel, there's enough good cards in this to still be a potent threat. Cloudpod, this is probably the most explosive combo deck in the format, but it relies on this little 2CP 5k surviving a turn, and sometimes you just don't get to that point. This deck can, off of turn 3 or 4, explode from a single cloud all the way into Warrior of Light, Yuffie, or Fina and a cloud on field, and you can even tag the cloud out for an Ishtola if you wanted to. The big change here is Zac. There's an argument Zac is win more, but it is very, very good to go Cloud for Zac, Zach gets Fina, or turns Zach into Fina. Zach brings an Aerith to the field. Fina activates Cloud. Cloud taps the Aerith. Aerith then turns into Yuffie. Attack Yuffie. Uh, Yuffie untaps the Cloud. Tap the Cloud onto like a Barret or something that the Yuffie brings back. Tag it into a Warrior of Light from deck. You'd have Fina, Warrior of Light, Yuffie, and Cloud all on field. It's pretty decent. You could even tag out the first Barret into. If you want to go really ham, tag the Barret out into a Rosa, activate the Cloud, tap the Cloud for the second Barret that you would have gotten off of the Aerith, tag that into your Warrior of Light. Now you have Warrior of Light, Rosa, Yuffie, Fina, and Cloud on field. Which is just absurd. And this is all off of Cloud Zac with obviously a lot of caveats, but so like the explosiveness of this deck basically can just win on the spot, but it can play a mid-range game too. Barret is just the idea of ZG to get Barret, play Barret, tap Barret, sack something is very, very good. And Barret's not once per turn. It's not once per copy of Barret. It's just good. It's so reliant on this 2CP 5K as a threat that it's very scary to take this to a tourney. Magissa is probably at like the bottom of tier 2. Much like why I don't like Cloud Pod. Magissa has a target on her back the size of New York City. Your opponent sees the Magissa, they will do everything in their power to get her off the field. Axstar and Alphino are still really good. Hedgehog Pie does give Magissa 3 self-pings, but there's not also really a way to search the Magissa. You can run into a lot of issues with bricking if you can't find your Magissa fast enough, because you do tend to run stuff like Axstar, which is hard to cast, and so on and so forth. So just kind of keep that in mind, but much like Cloudpod, this is one of the more explosive combo decks of the format. Lastly, I think Twins, especially Mono Water Twins, is still a legit deck. This is one that probably we won't see a lot of, and if we do see Twins, we'll see it probably paired with Rydia more, which is like more of like a tier 1.5 to 1.25 deck. But again, Palamporum, I've seen this deck outlast like full power Ice Wind, which sounds absurd, but like the Twins sitting there on the field by themselves, if they don't die, allows you to have consistent interruptions in a way that a lot of decks just aren't prepared for. And because it's on both players' turns, you have this like really efficient removal engine and interruption engine, and Firion and RCL are still very, very good cards. Tier 3, so probably go a little bit quicker through some of these. Avalanche, I think, is still a decent enough deck. It still plays very well with Chaos and Arc. Tifa is an interesting card, but Tifa is a weird one for this deck because while she's an Avalanche operative, Avalanche tends to not necessarily want to ramp backups very well. Maybe it could. Maybe that's actually the new game plan for Avalanche, is you just run like just a bunch of backup engines. Like you run just mono Earth backups, or like a bunch of Earth backups and one fire backup, like a one Elfie. So you can run stuff like the Leatherworker and use that, so you can use Tifa to just party attack individually with your bigs and then your wedge and go from there. But I think for now I'm going to put this in tier 3 until I'm more comfortable putting it somewhere higher. Still a good deck, still very powerful, just one that has kind of fallen off in favor of other aggro decks, namely 13 and 14. Ninjas still do have a very nice control game plan. They're less reliant on their big 2CP 5K than something like Cloudpod, but he's less impactful. The big thing Ninjas has over other decks is backup destruction, more so than any deck in the game. Being able to just play a Ninja for 1, later on crack it for 2CP to kill something like a Setzer could be very, very powerful late game. I would not be surprised to start seeing that Ninja start to become a tech in other decks, like a Wind Lightning deck or something like that. But in the meantime, I think this deck is right around the top of tier 3 for me. Earthwind midrange, there's still 3 ways that I see this being played. I am still Retainer's strongest proponent. I love this deck, but I think it's just a little bit too hard to pilot in either the like pure control form or in the Storm shell that I was playing when I played it around Opus 17, Opus 18 format. It's a good deck. It's really cool. I love the way it plays, but I do worry that it's a little bit too fair currently. You do have, I've seen a lot of Yuri, Yuffie unblockable decks where like you can go Northstalin, Leo, Yuri, and then all of a sudden you have this unblockable forward that like has 9k power and activates 2 backups every time he attacks. Pair that with Yuffie, it can be very hard to kind of clear that field. And this is a personal one that I've been kind of dabbling with, but I've been kind of messing with like playing the retainer engine as this way to just slow the game state to a crawl while you develop a large hand and a lot of backups, and then just going all in with like Bartz, Boko, Tifa, and then Tifa with like no attacking like 5 times in a turn just to win the game. Is that actually good enough? I don't know. But I think it's a really interesting concept because Bartz can give this Tifa haste without having to like try to make Barrett work in like an Earth Wind deck or anything like that, right? Dragoons, I still think is like a relatively strong tier 3 deck. Alice has a massive target on his back, but if Alice lives, they're drawing 3 cards a turn. Like, it doesn't matter how bad some of those cards are, they're still 2 CP in hand, and Freya is still one of the best boss monsters. I love that Freya is a common. They just didn't think this game was going to print 100 Dragoons, apparently. So, it didn't get anything. It got no help this set. But I think that the core is still, like, decent. Warriors of Light, this is mostly referring to, like, Refia control. I think if you can get the Refia with, like, 2 of the, like, Ignis and... what's his name? Ignis and... oh my god, Luneth. 2 of those backups. This deck really does have some cool playlines. Like, some of the most fun games I've played have been playing this deck and trying to, like, solitaire out how to untap to get the draw every turn while getting the most advantage out of it. Super, super, super cool deck. Maybe one of the most fun. Just, I also don't think it handles aggression very well. You have this really powerful recursive engine that scales very well into the late game, but it's going to have a lot of trouble getting there. Black Mages may actually be kind of the sleeper rogue contender just because a lot of really good decks right now are reliant on either 3 CP forwards or 9Ks, which Waltz 2 hits the 9Ks and Waltz 3 breaks the 3 or lesses. Rydia actually has a very, very hard time dealing with Waltz 3. That said, it is kind of again, it's a control deck in a format that might not necessarily be hospitable. You'd have to build this very specifically to the meta you expect to face for it to do well. Sky Pirates, these have kind of fallen off in favor of other wind decks, but I think that even just pure Sky Pirates is still a deck that is just kind of slept on. The Exodia boards of like Vaughn with Balthier and like 3 Sky Pirate backups and a Pinello are just kind of unbeatable. Doesn't get there very well. The deck space commitment's very high. You don't have a lot of room for non-engine, to use a Yu-Gi-Oh term. Like, you have to run this like critical mass of Sky Pirates, and a lot of them are not very good. But Vaughn is still a good card. Balthier is still very good. Pinello is still very good. It's just the supporting cast is just not quite there. Especially when you're factoring in that, like, Wind and Water don't have the defensive tools that other decks have. Maybe now with like the Goddess and Fat Chocobo, there's like a list that like plays those as like the top end to win the game in the future. Because like, so a lot of what Sky Pirates used to do when it was first being played, you know, it was eventually it transitioned away from this, but it was all the Sky Pirates and then 3 Leviathan and 3 Bismarck, and it would use Pinello as a way to develop the hand advantage to where Bismarck Leviathan was enough to just win the game, right? However, now maybe there's a 1-card answer. Maybe this deck runs the Goddess and you get to the Exodia board where your opponent can't clear it, and you use Pinello to generate the card advantage where you play the Goddess, Your opponent has one turn before all their forts are dead, and then you just swing in with all of the pirates for game. Now I kind of want to build Sky Pirates. I'm kind of talking myself into this deck. Guardians, I think if you are new to the game, this is my pick for the deck to play. It's either this or Retainers. However, it's not the most powerful deck ever printed. It's so good to learn how the game is played, because you have to learn how to play both an aggro game and a mid-range game. Like, you have to learn all of those elements at the same time. And you kind of learn, okay, here are some basic combos. You know, if we can go attack with one forward and then ject back our Tidus to play our Tidus to get another ject. We can go Tidus, Aerith, Tidus. Like, there's just so many little things that this deck does that are really, really good to kind of understand how to play this game at a higher level. Something like managing your real counters on Waka, I think, is a very important skill that this game develops. Okay, here are other resources other than just cards in hand. How do you manage those? When do you fire off your Waka ability? When do you use your check blocks? I don't think it's tier 1. I don't think it's even tier 2. But if you're new to the game, this deck costs like $25. And I think that if you spent a couple of weeks playing this, or even like, 1 to 2 locals, and if you feel confident with the combo lines of this, you can play any deck in the format and do well with it. FF12, good stuff. This is essentially using Fran as an extremely powerful card. This deck, I think, is really interesting. I think it's a deck capable of playing Warrior of Light, which is really cool. Begamnon is shockingly good if you're not paying for him, as it turns out. Same for Renok and Gijuk and all of those cards. The Viera engine is extremely slept on. I think people don't realize just how good that would be if it was in any element that isn't wind. You run 3 Joe, 3 Fran, and 1 Mirn. Fran is really good, and you just kind of use your 12 cards to toolbox, and you kind of run your opponent down in card advantage if they don't deal with the Fran. Again, it's another deck that has a massive choke point in Fran, but, I mean, if they don't deal with the 3 CP8K, you do just kind of win the game. Archfiends, this was my favorite deck last format to play casually. I don't think it got a lot of buffs this set. I think there's some interesting things you can do with Charlotta searching Cosmos so that Beldat is good in the deck. But it is going to struggle with aggro because Golbez is a turn 3 card, not a turn 1 card. You usually want to warp Golbez on turn 2. You want to back up, search Golbez, and then you warp the Golbez on turn 2, and then you start getting value on turn 3. That's just too slow against aggro decks sometimes. But this is a really, really cool deck. Monofire, good stuff. I'm going to have in tier 3. This actually did really well at a Materia Cup in Germany, so I can't poo-poo this too much. This might be too low. A lot of Monofire cards are very good, but it is one of those things where I would question what you're getting out of Monofire that you couldn't get out of another deck. Ilua is really, really good still. The Demon's really good, obviously. You still have in-archetype access to Amaterasu. Kuchaspel helps you cover things like Rydia and completely flip that on its head. It's just a question of, is the ceiling on Monofire good enough? Is killing something every turn, or going back up forward actually good enough in Opus 20? I don't think it is. I wouldn't play this, but this deck will see tops over the course of the event because Monofire always does. It's one of those decks you will always see Monofire pilots wherever you go. Everything else, we're going to go through some of these real quick. Monks have gotten no help since about Opus 14. So we're still waiting on some new stuff here. It's just not quite there. Bartz Boko is the deck's single most hurt by Sildra's ban because Sildra was a 1-card Bartz and Boko. Deck is still capable of just one-shotting the opponent, essentially. I've been hand-looped by this with a Bartz Boko pulling out Elena BE and just hand-looping out the best card in my hand, so I have no answers to what Bartz and Boko are doing, but it still is a deck that is extremely fragile. and every single card in this deck has a target on its back. Dancers are perpetually 2 cards away from being a playable archetype. Mayakov and Lilith are still really good. Nothing else really holds up. Knights are a deck that has not aged gracefully. Ramza is still a decent turn 1 warp. Ovelia is still really good. Agrias still debatably is fine. There's just not enough good stuff in this deck to make it work right now. And lastly, Opus 1 Golbez will steal games if you don't know what it does, if you don't have the Kukulkan or the Amaterasu on the stack when the Golbez does his thing. Know what this deck does, prepare for it the best you can. If you get donked by it, you can get donked by it. That happened to me not too long ago at Locals, where I had my super broken Rydia deck and I just didn't have Amaterasu for the Golbez and died on the spot. It happens. So that is my tier list. Hopefully that covers a lot of decks. Let's see, we're on, let's see if I can see the slide. 40 slides, so it's probably I covered about 30-ish decks in 40 minutes. If you guys are interested in some of these, want to know more about them, feel free to let me know in the comments down below, and let me know what you think. Where am I wrong on my tier list? What am I overrating? What am I underrating? What's the best deck that I am not thinking of at all? I will see y'all in the next one. Peace.